we've been serving local government since 1997 exclusively, and we are based in Florida as our primary office. We also have offices in Georgia, in North Carolina, and I am up in D.C. So we cover the southeast region of the United States fairly extensively. Our goals and objectives are consistent with what is known as the grandfather of all telecommunications regulations, the 1996 Telecommunications Act. And one of the things we try and do is give information to local government so that you guys can figure out how best to deal with the ever-evolving demands of communications infrastructure and communications providers. Among the things we do are wireless master planning of your communities. We also do individual site application reviews. We can assist in helping to revise your ordinance, something you should do if you haven't done so already in light of the FCC's report and order that I'm going to talk about in a little while from 2014. And we also can assist as a site manager for leasing and development of public land if you choose to use your public lands for the location of wireless infrastructure. So with that as a background of kind of who we are and what we do, and as you can tell, we've been doing it for a while. You also note that the industry has certainly evolved in all of those years, and so the one constant is an ever-changing terrain that you have to navigate when it comes to dealing with wireless communications and wireless infrastructure. And before I talk about the different types, let me just clarify. So you've got sort of two parties operating in the wireless field. You have the providers, your AT&Ts, your Verizons, your T-Mobiles, your Sprints, and some U.S. Cellular and some regional providers as well. And then you have the wireless infrastructure companies. But back in the prehistoric days, the phone companies, Verizon, AT&Ts, etc., they owned their tower. They built their towers. They owned their towers. They operated their towers. Much like a lot of other industries now, they generally don't do that anymore. Other companies have come along, which we are going to call infrastructure companies. The largest of which are companies like American Tower, SBA, Vertical Bridge, Crown Castle, etc. And now they own the infrastructure, and they lease space on that infrastructure to the AT&Ts, Verizons, etc. And so it's important to note the distinction between those two types of entities, because the first type, the AT&T and the Verizons, they are entitled to all of the rights, obligations, and privileges of the federal legislation as a communications provider. The infrastructure companies, unless they are paired with a provider, are not protected by federal regulation in terms of what you must allow or not allow, because they're in essence spec tower builders until and unless they are paired with a provider of wireless services. So that's an important distinction that you need to keep in mind when you get an application from someone. You want to make sure that the first thing you want to look for is who's the provider that is proposing to deliver some kind of wireless communication service from that infrastructure. The first or the most pressing frontier of that issue right now is the small cell and DAS frontier. The industry as a whole is pursuing a strategy called densification. And what densification means is they've got a fairly sizable footprint of what we'll call full-size or full-service wireless infrastructure throughout a good chunk of the country. But in order to deal with the ever-increasing amount of data and streaming and Instagram and Snapchat and everything else that everybody's doing on their phones, the only way to do that with a finite amount of spectrum is to increase the number of facilities in a given area and allow those multiple facilities to reuse that spectrum over and over again to allow more users using more data and engaging in more back and forth communications. And so the one way of doing that is the installation of what's called small cell technology, or DAS is another type of technology. And those are that's the current battleground area, because what we're seeing in particular is the wireless infrastructure industry trying to develop this type of infrastructure to lease to the wireless companies to serve as sort of a safety valve for capacity issues that each of the wireless companies are having. It's kind of like the simple analogy is if you're a T-Mobile subscriber in your home, you know your calls get offloaded to your Wi-Fi network. It's a similar type of thing like that. And so the primary issue that we're seeing in the past few months is that the infrastructure companies are approaching local jurisdictions, having gotten themselves registered as a utility under whatever applicable state public utilities commission requirements are, a task which I will tell you could be done by you or me in about 15 minutes, and alleging the right to use your right-of-way to install infrastructure such as this small cells or DAS infrastructure. There are some issues with that. One, if they are not paired with a provider, if you recall from before, if they're not paired with a wireless provider, then it's a spec tower, and from a federal regulatory standpoint, they're really not entitled to any deference in terms of federal regulations about deploying network and so forth and so on that I'm going to get into. But the real issue you've got to deal with is what your local jurisdiction requires. As far as public rights of way are concerned, there was a section in the 96 Act that talked about local government not creating barriers to the entry of wireless providers for communication services, but you'll note that there was a preservation of authority of state or local government to manage its rights of way and to, in some states, require compensation from providers on a neutral and non-discriminatory basis for the use of those rights of way. But I will tell you that there are jurisdictions where that compensation no longer exists. This is where you've got to deal with both your federal law and state law, and look at both of those and see what the Commonwealth provides. And I'll touch on that towards the end, and I'm sure you guys will have some questions about that, which I can get into greater detail when we get to questions. So you have to make sure that wireless providers have the ability to deploy their services and enable them to provide those services to their subscribers. So amongst those things, as long as you do them in a neutral manner, it could be allowing access to your local right-of-way in accordance with both the federal law and the Commonwealth law with respect to that. But you are allowed to develop regulations that will ensure the health and safety of your citizens by design and aesthetics and placement of infrastructure in that right-of-way. You've got to make sure that you're not having a pole put up that's going to be because of attachments on it blocking traffic from seeing a corner or something like that, or that it's located in a way, by way of example, I saw one on Friday where they put the pole in the right-of-way, moved the sidewalk over to the curb of the 4-lane road that it was next to, and now folks walking down that sidewalk are right up against traffic because they put the sidewalk out near the road in order to accommodate the pole, which I thought was not a good idea, but that jurisdiction chose to do it differently. So those are some of the balancing act you have to be able to do with respect to rights of way, and that's the, as I said before, that's the sort of current issue that's in everybody's face right now is wireless infrastructure companies wanting to get into the right of way to build infrastructure either for existing providers that they have partnered with, or in some instances they want to build infrastructure with the goal to later lease that to wireless providers. And you've got to be able to distinguish those two types of facilities or proposals, if you will, and deal with them accordingly. So those are the hot topics, if you will, and I'll come back to that with some. I'm sure you guys will have some questions towards the end, and I'll come back to that. So moving on from there, let me go back to the original 1996 Act to give you a little background. 47 U.S.C. 332, as you can see, said that it was preserving local zoning authority, but it said that local government had to regulate wireless infrastructure that didn't discriminate against the different types of providers and did not have the effect of prohibiting the provision of those services. The important factor you've got to do is if you're making a decision on a piece of wireless infrastructure, where it's going to go, what it's going to look like, et cetera, you've got to make sure that your adjudicating body, be it a zoning commission or a city commission or county commission, has to make a written decision. It has to be based on substantial evidence in the record, not based on speculation or not based on, heaven forbid, a federally preempted reason. Early on, you know, the crowds of people would show up with the No Tower T-shirts and whatnot, and they'd all be getting up and spending their 2 minutes telling the elected officials how they didn't want their kids irradiated by the towers and so forth and so on. And unfortunately, a lot of decisions were based on that type of feedback that they got from the public. However, the FCC regulates radio frequency emissions. Local government can say or do nothing about RF with the exception of asking the applicant to certify that they in fact comply with the FCC's regulations with respect to radio frequency emissions. That is the beginning and end of the discussion as far as local government is concerned on RF emissions. So you sometimes have to teach your elected officials that that cannot be a factor in their decision making because that is a federally preempted field, and they cannot be making a decision based on that issue. You can make decisions on other health and safety issues like will the tower fall over, is there a sufficient distance from a residence or something like that. Those are still permissible, but not on RF decisions. So that's Section 704, which was the first step in the progression. The industry, however, was not that excited by Section 704 because it felt like even though it got those rights, the municipalities and cities and counties across the country were sort of dragging their feet on their processing of applications. So after a number of years, the industry got the FCC to issue what's called the shot clock ruling. That came out in 2009, and it basically imposed a timeline for local governments to make decisions on applications. You had, at the time it came out, it was 90 days for co-locations and 150 days for new towers. That's since changed given the 2014 order, but the original ruling was 90 and 150. Co-locations being there's already a tower, it's got something on it already, and you're adding to it. Local government's supposed to act on those type of applications within 90 days. And if the new structure going up, you're supposed to act on it within 150 days. That means a written decision issued to the applicant within that timeline. So that was 2009. The industry liked that. It at least got things moving a little bit faster, but they still weren't completely happy. So they went to Congress in 2012, and buried somewhere in the middle of the Middle Class Tax Relief Act of 2012 was a little paragraph that said, state and local government cannot deny and shall approve any eligible facilities request for a modification of an existing tower that does not substantially change the dimensions of that tower. And I'm summarizing it, but you can read what Congress said right there on the screen. They said this would apply to any co-location or replacement of facility that did not, quote, substantially change the dimensions of the structure. But what Congress didn't do was define what was a substantial change. They just said it and left it to somebody else to figure it out. And that somebody else was the FCC. So in October of 2014, the FCC, after issuing in 2013 some preliminary guidance or informal guidance, they came out with a report and order, and they basically defined everything that Congress had talked about in the 2012 Section 6409 Act and more. And so this is the world you have to live in now in dealing with applications for either a co-location on an existing piece of something, infrastructure, or a new tower. So amongst the things the report and order of 2014 did was it streamlined a number of federal rules regarding NEPA and SHPO processing. It provided some exemptions for temporary towers from some of those processes. It created a new definition for substantial change and all the other terms that were in Section 6409. It made some clarifications to that shot clock that we had talked about earlier, and it created remedies for an applicant where a local government didn't meet the shot clock requirements. So I'm going to go through each of these in a little more detail for you. So we talked about 6409 said you shall approve and may not deny an eligible facilities request for co-location if there's not a substantial change. So what does that mean? Well, the first part of it is shall approve and may not deny. Okay, so that's pretty clear. You can't say no if it's an eligible facilities request, if it's a co-location, and if there is not a substantial change. So the first part of that is an eligible facilities request. That's something that's requesting a modification of an existing tower or base station that involves the co-location of equipment, the removal of equipment, or the replacement of equipment. So transmission equipment is defined as, and you can read the definition there, anything that's used in connection with the wireless transmission of radio frequency waves, basically. It's licensed spectrum, unlicensed spectrum, terrestrial, satellite, commercial mobile, private mobile, broadcast, public safety. Basically, if it's got an antenna, it's transmission equipment. It doesn't make a difference where in the panoply of the RF spectrum they operate. Licensed or unlicensed, it's irrelevant. If it's an antenna, it's transmission equipment. So that's that definition. And the second part of that is a tower or base station is anything that supports that equipment. So anything that that antenna is attached to is either a tower, and if it's not a tower, it's a base station. So if you've got an antenna on the roof of a building, that building is the base station. But if you got an antenna on a traditional tower, then that's a tower. That's the easiest way to distinguish it. A water tank, for example, isn't a wireless tower, but it is a base station. So that's a very big expansion of what the FCC has said is now subject to 6409, because I'll give you the easy example, or the extreme example of that. Suppose you have an amateur ham operator who has a copper wire running up a 150-foot tree in his backyard. That tree is now a base station, which means that a Verizon could co-locate on that tree if they wanted to, as long as they met all the other standards and definitions. So this is why I suggest to you that since the 2014 Act, you've got to probably make some changes to your regulations in order to make sure that you don't get those extremes that probably weren't contemplated by the FCC when they came out with all these definitions, but the effect of those definitions in the extreme examples are what could be problematic. Okay, so the next definition after that is, well, we talked about what a tower and a base station is. An existing base station means that at the time you get an application in from somebody, that wherever they're going, there's something there. It's got an antenna there, it's got some other kind of equipment there. But that means you have the right, or you have already passed on at some point that antenna or equipment being there. If it assumes, for purposes of co-location purposes, that at some point in the past the local government has approved, they've looked at an application to either attach an antenna somewhere or build a tower somewhere and said, yeah, we're okay with wireless infrastructure being at this address, you know, X marks the spot. So for purposes of co-location, having passed on it once, the FCC has said, well, you said it was okay for one thing to be there, so we're saying it's okay for something additional to be there. But if it was put up there without you passing on it locally, or if it didn't have to have local review, then there's no obligation under 6409 for you to approve that co-location. It had to have been approved at least once before in order for you to be compulsorily obligated to approve the co-location. So that's what an existing base station means. Next definition. So it went on to talk about as long as there is no substantial change in that existing tower or base station. So we talked about what an eligible facilities request is. We know what an existing tower or base station is. We know what transmission equipment is. So what is a substantial change? Well, substantial change comes into effect when you're talking about a co-location on that existing facility, and co-location is going to be defined as, the next slide, the mounting or installation of transmission equipment on an eligible support structure for the purpose of transmitting or receiving radio frequency signals.
About what constitutes.
So co-location for the purposes of 6409 does not mean that
for an eligible facility.
Infrastructure that already, getting crosstalk from something. Co-location does not mean only on structure that already has transmission equipment on it. It can be a co-location if it is, as I said before, gone through that state or local zoning review prior to the installation of transmission equipment. So again, if it's up in the air and it's got an antenna on it and somebody else is coming along and wanting to go on it, that's typically going to be a co-location. So that's the co-location as defined by the FCC. And then we get to the really difficult, if this wasn't difficult enough, we get to the really difficult definition, which is what is a substantial change? Because that's really the key. If it's a substantial change, you have some discretion. If it's not, you have to approve it. So a substantial change occurs if any of these criteria that are listed here are met. If it's in the right-of-way and it's going to be increased by 10% or 10 feet, whichever is greater, it's a substantial change. If it's not in a right-of-way and it's going to be increased 10% of the existing height or 20 feet, whichever is greater, it's a substantial change. Or if it's going to expand in width or girth by 6 feet in the right-of-way or 20 feet outside of a right-of-way, it's a substantial change. or if for some reason there's going to be the installation of a non-standard number of cabinets and shelters, and the FCC didn't bother to tell us what standard number is, but they said, well, if it's a non-standard number, and you'll have to figure that out on your own, it's a substantial change. Or if you're going to require excavation of some type outside the current footprint of the existing tower. So if there's already a fenced-in area or a compound or whatnot, and the addition is going to require, somebody to pour another 10 by 20 slab next to it and put their stuff down, that's a substantial change. Or, finally, if it's a concealed tower, if it's a pine tree, for example, maybe not the prettiest pine tree, maybe 150 feet tall and way above the height of all other pine trees anywhere near it, but it's a pine tree, and the addition is going to go up 20 more feet, and they're not going to re-sculpt the pine needles so that it looks like just the tree grew, but rather you're just going to have the antenna sticking out of the top of the pine tree, which I saw yesterday on 485 in Charlotte, right near the Ray Road exit. Then that's going to defeat the existing concealment of that pine tree, quote unquote, and that's going to be substantial change and require you to have some discretion over whether to approve it or not. So that's what substantial change now means. And again, if any of those conditions are met, then it's no longer a compulsory grant of the application for co-location, but a discretionary grant by the local government. Again, taking into account all the old 1996 Act about, not prohibiting service and so forth and so on. So the 6409 stuff remains subject to your existing building codes and all of your other structural and safety codes. Does not require you to abandon your generally applicable health and safety requirements on where stuff is going to go, electrical code issues, particularly if there are going to be generators, noise control, also for generators, and so forth and so on. So it's not a get-out-of-jail-free card. It's just, as far as the discretion for the placement of the facility, assuming all the other standards are met, goes away if it's a non-substantial change on a co-location. So that we've now defined all the different things in Section 6409, and so now the FCC has told you what Congress meant back in 2012. Aren't you happy to know all of that now? All right, so moving on.
Well,
after they
real quick, before
defined
you move
all
on,
of that.
Anthony?
Yes.
Before you move on, will you talk just a little bit or clarify a little bit about what constitutes an approval for an eligible facility? Specifically about the site plan, how it meets that criteria.
I didn't understand what you meant.
Meaning, how is it considered an eligible facility? Because we get that question quite a bit. If they go through just building permit, is it now considered an eligible facility, or does it have to go through site review plan first?
That's going to, so that's going to depend on each jurisdiction's requirements for how they process wireless infrastructure applications. But typically, if the applicant submits it to you and says, hey, I'm 6409 eligible, give me a grant, they need to provide you with information in order for you to ascertain, number one, that in fact they are 6409 eligible, that there's not going to be a substantial change. So you're going to need construction drawings, you're going to need a lot of data in order for you to initially determine, because that gets into the timeline I'm going to get to shortly, initially make a determination as to whether or not, in fact, this co-location is 6409 eligible or not. Because again, if it's not, it becomes discretionary on your part as to whether or not to grant that application. So the first thing you're going to need is a whole lot of information from the applicant. You should not take them at face value that they are, if they are coming to you and saying that they are 6409 eligible and you must approve them. you need to, and you are allowed to request information from them in order for you to determine if, in fact, they are 6409 eligible as the FCC has now defined it in the report and order. So I will talk about a little bit more of that as we go through the timeline part of it as to what information you need. But typically, you're going to need to know all of the things that I talked about in determining whether or not it's a substantial change. So how high are you going to add on to? How much wider is it going to get? Are you going to be excavating outside of the existing compound? You know, what kind of concealment, if it's a concealed facility, what's your installation going to do as far as the concealment is concerned? How many cabinets are you going to put in and whatnot? All of those things will factor into the equation of whether or not you can determine if it's a substantial change so that you don't have to take their word for it. So hopefully that answered that question. But I'm sure I'll get some more specific questions when we're done with the PowerPoint, and I can take them and give some answers to some specific questions.
Okay.
Okay, so turning now to the other parts of the report and order, if it's 6409 eligible, you now have to process that within 60 days. Remember, we talked about the shot clock. It was 90 days for co-locations. That got shortened for 6409 eligible applications to 60 days. So if it's a shall approve application, if it's 6409 eligible, you now must process that within 60 days. If it's not, turns out it's a co-location that is not 6409 eligible, then the 90-day clock still applies. The 60-day clock for these shall approve 6409 applications is told if you tell the applicant within 30 days, you haven't given us enough information. We can't tell if it's 6409 eligible or not with what you've provided. So here's what's missing. Here's what we need. We're stopping the clock. Let's say you get it on October 1. You write them a letter on October 15th saying, hey, we're missing A, B, C, D, E, and F. The clock stops on October 15th and does not restart until they resubmit to you. So that's how you, it's not, it doesn't restart after that. It picks up, so 15 days have still elapsed, and there's 45 more days after they resubmit the material to you before you have to make a decision. So that's the timeline for 6409 eligible applications. You've got to move fairly promptly in processing them, and I'll explain why in the next slide. I talked about if it's not eligible, then the 90-day clock applies. But if you don't act on that 6409 application within the 60 days, the FCC says that application is now deemed granted. That's a change from back in the shot clock days with the 90-day ones. If you didn't act within 90 days in the old days, 2009 and forward, the applicant would have to go to court and to ask the court to declare that the application should be granted. Now, if it's 6409 eligible, if you don't act in 60 days, it's granted as a matter of law. You then have the opportunity as a local government to go to court to challenge the deemed granted remedy, but the burden is now on you as the local government to go and convince a judge that it shouldn't be deemed granted, and there was a reason why you didn't act within 60 days. Maybe because you didn't get complete information and the applicants resubmitted to you and said, oh, it's complete, but you still couldn't figure it out. The variety of reasons why. But the burden is now on local government to challenge the deemed granted remedy. The FCC has put the shoe on the other foot, if you will. So that's a big change. So that's, again, another reason why you need to make sure that when you take in an application for co-location, you first ascertain if it's eligible for 6409, and then you get it acted upon in a timely fashion. Otherwise, you don't have any discretion. It's going to be deemed granted. All right, next. So that's one of the reasons, as I've been harping on probably, to update your regulations to make sure that you are consistent with what 6409 as defined in the FCC report and order say, so that your local regulations are consistent with what the FCC now deems to be appropriate. And you need to be able to regulate other kinds of infrastructure because of that expanded definition of eligible facilities. You've got to look at other things that are in your community and deal with them in terms of regulations because of the potential for co-location on those things, like that 150-foot tree with the copper wire on it, which is an eligible facility now. You need to be proactive when you get an application to build a new structure, because it's not just going to be whoever's coming in there. You need to recognize that whatever's being built, let's say there's an applicant who wants to put up a 100-foot tower with one carrier in your community. Well, because of 6409, you now know that that tower can now grow to at least 120 feet in height, and that other parties can go on it, and you're not going to have a lot of say over those second and third and fourth parties on it. So you better be sure when the first party's going on it and building it, that it's where you want it and is what you want it to look like, because once the horse has left the barn, you're not going to have a lot of say over it. And if you have deep insomnia, you can follow that link and read the entire 155 pages of the FCC's report and order, which I tried to distill down into 30 or so slides. There's a lot of information there, but if you're going to retool your regulations, I recommend you read it, you get a good handle on what you can and can't do, and you revise your local regulations to match as much as you can what the FCC report and order says, so that you're in processing things as they come in and dealing with them. So that's the very brief version, believe it or not, of the FCC report and order. Next is some references to some Virginia statutory provisions you should also be aware of. The Commonwealth has encouraged the development of master planning for wireless infrastructure. You are bound by state law to act on all wireless siting applications within 90 days, subject to some extensions, so it's somewhat consistent with the federal rule. You've also got the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which has a long case history of deciding wireless siting matters that are binding in Virginia. I'm sure a number of the communities are aware of their history and stare decisis that has been applied in challenging certain siting decisions and what is allowed and what isn't allowed. And as far as the hot spot today, which is the RO right-of-way access issues, there's some Commonwealth statutory provisions on what a local government can do as far as communications infrastructure within your rights of way that you also need to be familiar with and harmonize your local regulations with to control the growth of infrastructure within your right of way, which is, as I said early at the outset, is the current battlefront of the wireless siting infrastructure community right now. That's where everybody's looking to build. So with that, I will attempt to answer questions, if anyone has any, with respect to this on any specific issues that either I touched on or issues that you may have encountered in receiving wireless applications and trying to figure out what to do with them. And bear with me because I am new to apparently GoToWebinar, and I have to figure out how to...
I will read this for you here, Anthony.
Okay.
One of the questions came in. It said, if the only approval for an existing antenna is a building permit, is the tower or base station still considered an eligible facility? or since the building code is a state regulation, does some sort of other local review have to have occurred? So,
okay. I just found that question, so let me try and expand my screen to read it. Is tower or base station still? If the only approval for an existing is so if the initial approval is a building permit, yes. If it's gone through some sort of, well, the FCC calls it zoning approval, but yeah, so I see what your distinction is. If it's just a building permit, has it gone through some sort of zoning approval? My initial inclination would be to say yes. By issuance of the building permit, you've decided to allow an antenna of some sort on a piece of infrastructure, building or water tank or something like that in your community, and the FCC would look at that as saying, well, it's gone through some sort of regulatory process initially, and so now it becomes an eligible facility and therefore becomes 6409 eligible for co-location, because it went through some sort of process, even though it was only a building permit. I don't know that there's been any sort of adjudicatory decision as to whether that particular issue, how that particular issue would play out, but I think that would probably be the conclusion that the FCC would come to say that it's been through some sort of zoning review. But I don't know, because I could also argue the second point, which is since the building permit is based on state code, you as the local government haven't really adjudicated yet. You're simply following what the state code requires. And so the simple answer to that would be change your code to require that any type of wireless infrastructure requires at least some rudimentary zoning review by either a zone, even if it's just a zoning official reviewing an application and granting it, or not, depending on what came in, but because then it would in fact at least undergo some type of actual zoning review. I'm trying to envision an instance where it would just be a building permit, and I guess it could be if it's just being mounted on the side of something, but I think the FCC would view it as it went through some sort of local review. All right, I see there was another question about something about intellectual property, and I'm trying to figure out how to grow my screen to read that. Oh, here we go. You mentioned that we need to get first approval rights if a new tower is approved by special exception from our BZA with conditions or height and flush-mounted antennas. How does this apply to height and width increases allowed under substantial change? So if your first approval says you are approved at 100 feet and you have to flush mount your antenna, and that would be a concealment type of concealment, the flush mounting of the antenna. When you go to look at that substantial change provision, if a co-locator came along and said, we want to increase that 100-foot tower by 19 feet and we're not going to co-locate, that would be a substantial change, not because of the 19-foot increase, because it would not be a substantial change if it were under 20 feet. This is assuming it's not in a right-of-way, so it's 10%, 10 feet, or 20 feet, whichever is greater, so in this case 20 feet. But if the second applicant proposed non-flush mounted and therefore non-concealed, it would have the effect of defeating the concealment elements, which was one of those standards in substantial change, and so then you would not have to mandatorily approve that installation, but would have some discretion to say yay or nay on it if they insisted on not concealing that second installation, because it would be defeating the existing concealment efforts of that tower. So that would be the answer to that particular issue. All right, let's see what else I have here.
You missed one, Anthony. It's during any stage of the wire. You can see that one?
I can't see that one for some reason. Would you read it to me?
Sure. During any stage of the wireless master planning infrastructure, will you need to involve anything regards of intellectual property related issue that may need assistance of an attorney who specializes with intellectual property or trademark?
Not to my knowledge. I don't know that those issues have arisen, with the exception of a number of jurisdictions initially used in describing concealment technologies. They would describe them as stealth. Stealth is a trademark of a company in North Carolina that designs and markets concealment technologies for wireless infrastructure. And so other than not using the word stealth, but rather using the word concealment, I'm not aware of any other intellectual property or copyright or trademark issue that would arise out of the regulation of ordinances, or the revision of ordinances, I should say. All right, so the next one I have is providers have told our local building officials that placement of an antenna on an existing structure, such as the roof of a building, does not require a building permit. The building code official is whether a service provider proposing to do this is exempt from the requirements of the building code. Do you know whether a building permit is required for this in Virginia? I do not, because I am not an expert on the Virginia building code, but I will tell you that depending on what the regulations are in your community, assuming you have some already, regarding the placement of wireless infrastructure, the placement of I'm assuming that first antenna on a building, which would be a new installation, so it's not a co-location where it's a shall approve and may not deny, but I'm assuming it's a first installation of an antenna on a building, is going to require some sort of an application in addition to a building permit, assuming again that you have some regulations in your community governing the installation of wireless infrastructure. It should not be, if you have some regulations, just a building permit. And but even if you didn't have any even if you didn't regulate wireless infrastructure at all, I would think at a minimum you would need a building permit in order to put something on the roof, because remember that infrastructure is adding weight, for example, to that roof. So you're going to want a structural to make sure that adding that weight to the roof isn't going to impact the stability of the roof of that structure. And so at a minimum, you'd want a building permit to ensure that. But in addition to a building permit, I would hope you have some regulations in place that would allow you to put an application together that would pass on the necessity of that infrastructure on that building from a technical standpoint. All right, so could I elaborate on the width expansion of 6 feet in the right-of-way? So if it blocks a sidewalk or encroaches into an actual roadway, there is no ability to say no. There is an ability to say no if you still have, as I mentioned before, you're right under your existing health and safety from a physical standpoint regulations to insist on the placement of infrastructure in your right-of-way so that it's not creating a pedestrian hazard or a vehicular hazard or a visual obstruction of some sort for traffic or pedestrians to see each other, so forth and so on. The 6-foot expansion is if you have a piece of infrastructure in your right-of-way already, and it is going to increase by virtue of a proposed co-location by more than 6 feet in girth at any point on that vertical infrastructure, then that becomes a substantial change, which means that you have the ability to say no to that application. If it's going to be less than 6 feet, the FCC says that you shall approve and may not deny that application, but with the caveat that even if it's only 5 feet, if that 5 feet means you're now forcing the pedestrians out into the street, well, then your health and safety code takes precedence over that, and you could, in that scenario, say no, because that expansion, even though it's a non-substantial change, creates a health and safety issue. And so in that case, you would still be able to say no to that because of the issue that it presents. Can a height limit ever be considered part of the concealment approval, i.e. a silo approved to a maximum height because only that height would be proportionate to existing structures on the property? Are they then still entitled to put extra height on the silo if it is designed as an expansion of the silo? Yes, if the addition of something less than 20 feet, presumably, of that silo did not have the effect, again, of destroying the concealment elements of that facility as a silo of some type. So if silos across the country are only 100 feet and they're never any taller than that, if you made a 120-foot silo, anybody looking at it would know, well, that's not a silo because they're only 100 feet. But I don't think that's the case. I think silos probably come in different heights, and as long as the co-location that was increasing the height increased the overall concealment of that silo to just a higher height, it would still be a 6409 eligible application because they would be preserving the concealment element of the silo. But if they weren't, if they were doing, as I described that pine tree down in Charlotte was doing, which is they just stuck the antenna on top of the tree that was otherwise concealing the initial installations and didn't conceal the new antenna at all, then that would be destroying the concealment element, and then that would not be permissible.
If anyone wants to ask a question, I can certainly unmute you. If you want to just hit, like you click on the little hand, and then I can unmute you. Any other questions?
Wait, I think I see some.
Oh, yeah, no. Here we go. Yep. And I am unmuting David McGettigan. Go ahead, David.
The recent changes to 15.2.2232G that we no longer can require a public facility review if it's within a zone. Do you want to tell people a little bit about that?
You're talking about the Commonwealth statutory revisions? Yeah, I am not by any means an expert on Virginia Commonwealth statutory rules, so I can't really comment on that. The purpose of this was to discuss the federal regulatory issues. You really have to consult with your city or county attorney on the state statutory obligations. As I am not licensed to practice law in the Commonwealth, I refrain from doing so.
All right, that's fair.
Any other questions out there? Oh, wait.
All right. Well, everybody kept it right on time because we're 2 minutes to 1 p.m. So, barring anything else,
Nope, that's it.
Anthony,
I will thank everybody. Yes?
Anthony and Elizabeth, this is Eldon. Thank you all very, very much. We really appreciate this. The Virginia chapter of American Planning Association is happy to be doing this, happy to having you guys on board. Thanks again to the Berkeley Group for sponsoring this series. As mentioned earlier, our next webinar is October 24th. We will be hearing from Milton Hurd. He'll be telling us about the principles of effective facilitation, herding cats 101, no pun intended. And you'll see e-blast and newsletters going out shortly in your inboxes that will have a link to registering for that presentation. Again, thanks to everybody for being here today, and we hope you've enjoyed it and gotten a lot out of it. I certainly learned a lot, and I'm looking forward to the big fight this year over changing Virginia's statute.
Yes. If there's any questions after the fact, they're certainly welcome to reach out to either myself or Anthony, and you can get a hold of us at anthony@cityscapegov.com or elizabeth@cityscapegov.com, or you can certainly call us anytime.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great one.
Thank you.